thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I'm mainly going to be talking about multisensory environments, so also known as sensory rooms or Snuzellen rooms. These are spaces that contain a whole different range of different equipment and objects that kind of provide sensory stimulation. So common things might be a bubble tube or tactile boards, fiber optics. Often there's a projector as well, and you can kind of change the global lighting of the room as well. So change this from blue to red or whatever you want. And sensory rooms are really common in educational settings. You also find them in hospitals and community settings where they're used by both children and adults. And generally you might use them for relaxation, enjoyment, and meeting sensory needs, because you can kind of really control different aspects of the sensory environment. But despite the fact that they're really widely used, and in fact they're part of different educational policies as well, there's really very little research on how they're being used, what the best practices might be for using them in order to kind of produce different outcomes, and what these outcomes might be in terms of the benefits and challenges or drawbacks of using the rooms. So a few years ago, we set about to try and answer some of these questions, and the research I'm going to be talking about today, it's based on Katie Unwin's PhD mainly, and it's very much in collaboration with Dr Catherine Jones, who's director of the Wales Autism Research Centre and was Katie's other supervisor. So because there was so little research on this, we thought, well, where do we start trying to answer some of these questions? And so what we thought is, why don't we just go out and speak to educational practitioners and find out about their experiences of using the rooms, their beliefs and opinions about them. So this is what Katie did. She interviewed 10 practitioners, then conducted a thematic analysis, and from this 6 themes emerged. So the first was that it was perceived that MSCs could benefit behaviour, attention and mood. And these were benefits that were seen within the session. So for example, it makes them happy, it's as simple as it gets. But also the practitioners talked about how it could transfer out into the classroom afterwards. So they would have a sort of calmness that then would transfer into the class. The practitioners believed that the sensory rooms had distinct properties that could facilitate benefits, and some of this was related to the child being able to control their environment. So having a controlled environment helps you to eliminate some of these things, external distracting noises, for example, so that they can start to learn. But also the equipment was seen as being very motivating, and being in the sensory room helped to facilitate relationship building with the teachers and also the students' peers as well. But all of the practitioners felt that using the sensory room really needed to be centred on the child's needs, their capabilities, their preferences. So tailoring how you use the room to individual needs and appreciating that every child is different. They also thought that the practitioner really needed to play an active role, and it was key for producing outcomes. So one practitioner even said the most important piece of equipment is the adult who is working with the child. And it might not necessarily be the room, it's actually the close relationship of working one-to-one with the practitioner that is important, more so than just being in the sensory room per se. They emphasised that the MSCs were really great environments for teaching and learning, and they offered more possibilities than, say, a typical classroom environment. So they're having fun and they don't realise they're learning when they're having fun, or it eliminates some of those sensory needs so that they can start to learn. But there were some challenges that were identified. Some children becoming overstimulated for being in the sensory room, other children's becoming quite obsessive with being in the sensory room. And also other practitioners talked about how actually you can find really positive outcomes in other environments as well. It wasn't just something that was just limited to the sensory room. So these findings were really interesting, but of course, like many qualitative studies, it was a relatively small sample. And so what we wanted to do next was to try and see how representative these themes would be in a larger group of practitioners. So we took the themes that had emerged and we translated them into a 27 item survey that we then sent round to over 100 practitioners in the UK and asked to what extent they agreed with different statements that reflected the themes. And we found that overall, the larger group of practitioners tended to agree with most of the themes that had come from the qualitative study. Interestingly, the theme 6, MSc can present some challenges, was the one that was agreed with the less, suggesting that kind of overall the practitioners tend to have a very positive perception of using sensory rooms. So going forward in Katie's PhD, what we really wanted to do was to try and unpack some of these really interesting themes that had emerged from this research, and to try and kind of test them out in a more experimental and observational setting. And we particularly were interested in theme number 3, so MSc use should be centered on a child's needs. And some of the things that the practitioners have talked about here was emphasizing how important it was for the child to be in control of their sensory environment, and how this was one of the benefits of being in the sensory room, was having that control. And so what we were interested in to do in a kind of more controlled behavioural study was to answer the question, well, does having control over the sensory changes in the sensory room influence any behaviours, such as behaviours, mood, or physiological arousal? So at the Wales Autism Research Centre, we have our own custom-built sensory room, so it was kind of the perfect place to do this study. And the design of the study is that we have 2 conditions. So we had an active change condition, and in this condition the children were given complete control of the sensory changes within the room. They were given an iPad so they could change the colour or the sounds of the different equipment they were engaging with. And then we had the passive change condition, and here the sensory changes kind of cycled through automatically, or the experimenter made the changes in the room. And it was a within subjects design, so all of the participants took part in both conditions, but it was counterbalanced across participants. And the way it worked is that the children would come into the room and they'd spend 3 minutes at each piece of equipment in a random order. We then video recorded these sessions, and we coded the behaviours that we observed. So the behaviours we were interested in were all inspired by things that had come up during the qualitative interviews we did earlier, things that practitioners had talked about being influenced by being in sensory rooms. So things like social behaviour, repetitive motor behaviours, attention, anxiety, positive affect, sensory behaviours, stereotyped speech, and vocalizations. And we also used a heart rate monitor to measure arousal or heart rate variability and activity. And the participants in the study were 41 autistic children aged between 4 and 12. And you can see here we have a really large range of nonverbal IQ scores as well. So what did we find? Well, when children had control over the sensory changes in the room, we actually found that their attention increased. So they spent much more time engaging with the piece of equipment than maybe going off in the room and doing other things. Interestingly, we also found that sensory seeking behaviours reduced when the child had control over the sensory changes. And our kind of explanation potentially for this is that maybe because the children had control, they were better able to meet their sensory needs, and so they didn't necessarily need to display so many sensory seeking behaviours. Interestingly, also, we found that repetitive motor behaviours reduced. Now, it was in no way a goal of the study to try and reduce any of the core characteristics of autism, such as RMBs. However, we do know that they have been associated with sometimes with signs of discomfort or anxiety, and so we're hoping that perhaps our finding here might be reflective of that. We also found a reduction in stereotyped and idiosyncratic speech and vocalizations when the children had control in the sensory room, but we didn't find any other differences in social communication or any of the other measures we looked at. We didn't find a difference in arousal between the 2 conditions, control or no control, but we did find that generally arousal was lower when the children were in the sensory room than when they were outside in a general play area with non-sensory toys. So, I mean, this is an interesting finding, or preliminary finding, which I think we'd hope to follow up maybe in a real kind of classroom sensory room comparison. So why do we think that some of the outcomes were different when children had control over their sensory experience in the room? Well, we think that if children are better able to meet their sensory needs, then this is going to provide some more positive outcomes. And this was certainly something that was reflected in the qualitative stage of the study when we spoke to practitioners as well. There's also kind of been a interest over the last maybe 10 years or so in theories about predictability and uncertainty, thinking about, say, Bayesian frameworks or predictive coding frameworks, which, when thinking about kind of how anxiety is related to sensory experience in autism, have thought about whether it's something to do with the stimuli being unpredictable or uncertain that can create kind of more negative reactions. So it's possible that providing control over your sensory world within the room will help to increase the predictability of the sensory environment. And then taking sensory experience kind of out of the equation completely, it's also the case that just generally, if you give people more agency and more choice in their lives, this is generally associated with increased well-being. And we see this also if you give people or children choices over what toys they play with, for example. So what's the potential relevance for learning? Well, as I said previously, meeting sensory needs is likely to create better conditions for learning. So we found some potential evidence of this in terms of attention in our study, and also the practitioners talked a lot about mood and affect being influenced by being in the sensory room and controlling the stimuli as well. These conditions will help to create better relationships with the practitioners. Better relationships are likely also to lead to better conditions for learning. And also, it's the case that there's a lot of causal learning that can happen in a sensory room, just cause and effect. I press this button and I get this response back, which could be really useful for some children. So at the end of the main study, we also allowed the children to go into the sensory rooms and just have 5 minutes of free play where they could play with anything they wanted to in the sensory room. And we recorded these sessions as well. And what we were interested in here was, if you're a teacher and you have a very limited budget to buy equipment, what's the best piece of equipment? What's going to get used the most? And what we found is that the bubble tube was the most popular piece of equipment, followed by the touch, sound and light boards, then the fiber optics, and then finally the tactile board. But what we were really interested in is whether a child, does the individual characteristics of the children, so for example, their sensory profile or their cognitive ability, is that predictive of, in any way, of what kind of pieces of equipment they might prefer? And we did find some kind of interesting correlations here. So, for example, children whose parents reported that they had kind of fewer sensory sensitivity behaviours, but more sensory seeking behaviours, tended to prefer the bubble tube. And also children that tended to have lower non-verbal IQ preferred the bubble tube as well. Whereas children whose parents reported that they had more sensory avoidance behaviours and fewer sensory seeking behaviours tended to prefer the touch, sound and light board and the tactile board. And indeed, if you had higher non-verbal IQ, this was also correlated to preferring these two pieces of equipment. And there are some kind of interesting modality specific effects here that I don't have time to go into, but so I think these results are really interesting. They might be useful, for example, for practitioners trying to think about how to tailor sensory room sessions to the individual characteristics of the child. And also just generally, it's often very hard to find a relationship between a questionnaire measure of sensory experience and a kind of observable sensory behavior in the world. And so it's kind of interesting that we might have found that here, and we're hoping to follow this up in the future. So talking of the future, what's next for this? Well, currently there are no guidelines for how to use sensory rooms in educational settings, and we're hoping to fill that gap by creating the Cardiff University Sensory Room Guide, which we're doing in collaboration with practitioners, families of autistic children and autistic people themselves. We have a PhD student starting in October who's going to pick up where Katie left off and try and do some more in-depth observations of sensory rooms in kind of real world settings, and looking at a wider range of children as well. At the moment, we've really just focused on autistic children, but actually these rooms are used by a whole wide range of other children as well. At Cardiff, we have a neurodevelopmental assessment unit where children with behavioural, cognitive and emotional difficulties come in and do various different assessments. And as part of this, they're going to have a free play session in the sensory room. And we're hoping to use this to follow up and see how kind of individual strengths and difficulties for children might relate to how they use and experience the sensory room. And then finally, we have a PhD student who's interested in sensory equipment and sensory rooms in supported living settings for adults with an intellectual disability, some of whom are also autistic. Again, this is a really under-researched area, and so hoping to kind of fill that gap as well and answer some of the same questions about how best to use sensory equipment in these settings. So speaking about this, I know I'm a bit short on time, but I just wanted to finish quickly with some work that I've been doing recently on smart technology in supported living settings, just because I think there might be some other talks about smart technology in this conference, and it's actually what I mainly do for my day job. So over the last few years, I've been interested in how smart technology, particularly smart speakers, can help to support people to live more independently. Particularly increasing digital inclusion for individuals that may face barriers accessing standard kind of ways of connecting to the internet, like computers and tablets, and whether we could see any improvements in well-being and loneliness. So I conducted a kind of randomized controlled trial where smart speakers were provided to supported living settings for people with an intellectual disability. And we found some kind of interesting quantitative and qualitative results from this. So some themes around smart speakers helping to provide social value and companionships to individuals, easier access to entertainment and fun, helping to improve independence and agency, but of course some challenges as well. And we also found some interesting findings that smart speakers could actually help to improve speech intelligibility as well. And we're following this up currently in children with speech difficulties. And part of the PhD that I mentioned earlier is going to be exploring whether smart technology can be used in supported living settings to help to improve and enhance the kind of sensory experience of people with an intellectual disability. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much, particularly to Katie Unwin, who carried out most of the work that I talked about today, and Catherine Jones, her other supervisor, and the collaborators on the Smart Technology project. Oh, and also to Mike Ayres for helping to fund the sensory room, and to everyone for listening.